World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, historian and researcher of the Second World War, Nick Schweitzer. And before we go any further, most of you might have noticed that the logo has recently changed. A couple weeks ago, with how the platform is growing, it was time to do a little bit of a rebrand. After working with an amazingly creative designer, thank you so much, Kurt, we came up with digital art that we will be using as our main logo, and we will now also have a mascot logo. A simple tank that will simply be known as Moody. Now, for those of you that have no idea why we would name it that, this is paying homage to In the Mood, an American M4 Sherman led by famous tank ace Lafayette War Daddy Poole that would crush panzer units across France and into Germany. The tank crew is highly decorated, and we feel this is an excellent way to keep memories alive. With that, we are currently working on custom hats, cups, coffee mugs, and vinyl stickers made with Moody front and center. We are extremely excited and hope to see a few fellow historians and history lovers wearing it out and about. With that, I will quit rambling about the nonsense and get to what you are all here for. Second episode on the Warconomy series, The Shadow of the Strausses. And as we covered in our most recent episode, there were in fact Germans who had become incredibly wealthy during the interwar period. One of those individuals being that of Gunther Quandt, Germany's wealthiest man, who also was a participant in atrocities due to the use of slave labor and their murder. As we learned, Quandt would escape any severe punishment and would only be held under arrest for a year without charge. He would end his days still in power with immense wealth. This was not always the case, and especially was not the case for German Jews who were amongst the wealthiest. One example of this, and the one that we're going to dive into this week, is the Strauss family of Essen. So I did a ton of research and read a phenomenal book from Mark Rosenberg titled The Past in Hiding, which is the only written biography of this family, and we're going to find out why exactly that is. I'll be jumping around a tad bit, so please just stay with me through all of this, and then it'll come back together in the end. So Leopold Strauss was an ethnic German Jew born in the mid-1800s and was one out of 11 children, incredibly ambitious of not only the outside world but his faith. Leopold Strauss would be the only one of his siblings to gain a secondary education, eventually becoming a rabbi and a teacher. Over time, he would gain power and become the headmaster of the Dinslaken Jewish school. He and his wife Sally would bring 3 sons, 2 of which, Alfred and Siegfried, would go on to launch a business empire. Now, Siegfried would eventually marry into the Rosenberg family, and I'll get to that in a little later. But at this point, I'd like to talk about Isaac Rosenberg, who was the same generation of Leopold, and who was a son of a large grain and fodder business in Essen. While Isaac would grow to take over the business, he would eventually land in politics and was incredibly powerful in his home city. He, however, would die in 1932, a year before the Nazis rose to power, and these 2 men ultimately were the foundations that would lead the Strausses to their massive wealth. There is a main side of the story we're going to talk about, and that is of Siegfried. Now, Siegfried and his 2 brothers were incredibly close, and he was closest to his brother Albert. As the boys were becoming men and trying to decide on which way in life they'd like to take, realizing there was an enormous future in the grain and fodder business, the boys and brothers set out to learn ropes of the industry. Being born in 1891, the Strauss brothers were primates when the world went to war in 1914. But this isn't a hindrance for Siegfried. You see, in 1910, at the age of 21, Siegfried enlisted and served a year in the German Imperial Army. Patriotic and filled with the responsibility of his duty, Siegfried would not hesitate to go back into the army during World War I. There is an interesting fact to point out here. Most units in World War I were almost pieced together like National Guard units that we see here in the United States. They would keep enlistees and draftees from the same cities and regions together. So for Siegfried, who had grown up in a heavy Jewish community, he would serve primarily with all Jews in the German army during World War I. To look at the bigger picture of that, roughly 20% of all Germans who fought in the First World War were of Jewish heritage. Siegfried, being only 26th time when the world would end, would receive the Iron Cross for gallantry. So Siegfried completes his service and comes home to a country that has not only been ravaged by war, but its economy is in a critical position. Siegfried decides to not rejoin the fodder immediately and get back into work as food administration at his local government in Essen. But within a year of this, he had had enough and was ready for something more, and so was his brother Albert. The brothers would pool their money together and start the company Bruder Strauss OHG, and it would be headquartered in their hometown of Essen. Now, this company did not originally farm and produce the feed. What the company most profited from was bringing overseas grain and feed from producers and then broker the product across the country, keeping whatever the difference was as their commission. This proved to be incredibly profitable from the start, and as a large majority of German businesses were failing in the 1920s, they were thriving at an unbelievable level due to the fact that what they had was essential to the survival of the German people and its infrastructure. Without grain and fodder for farm animals, you risk placing your people into a position of starving. And that usually is an unacceptable route to take as world leaders, who the Germans spared no cost when keeping their agricultural and farming industries afloat. It is during this time that Siegfried would meet and fall in love with Regina Rosenberg, the daughter of Isaac Rosenberg that we spoke about earlier. Being incredibly wealthy herself, the two combined the families in 1922 and joined the highest ranks of German and Jewish society. Now, while his family life moving forward was good, he turned back to his business. Instead of continuing down just grain and fodder, he knew he needed something else. And in the same year he married his wife, his company completed their first property deal, creating passive income through rents. Their business empire was spreading, but so was their family. And on June 7th, 1923, Siegfried and Regina would welcome their first child and only daughter, Mary Ann. Now, I'm not going to dive way into Mary Ann's childhood, as there's a ton to unpack with it, but let's just cover some of the facts that way we have a better idea of the wealth this family had. In the 1920s, they lived in an immaculate 3-story home with a built-in cellar. Siegfried and Regina were also known to take extensive skiing trips in the Swiss Alps, often leaving their children behind with a nanny. I say children because they would additionally have a son. However, later in the story, he was now very old by the time World War II came around. Siegfried was also insanely strict with how money was spent, in the sense of giving money to his kids and like an allowance. It was not a reasonable expectation. For him, he believed that they had had more than enough. Mary Ann remembers one time snagging a little bit of cash out of her mother's chest for something along the lines of candy. And when her mother, Regina, came back to count it that night and found out money was missing, all hell would break loose. And this wasn't something that was just because they were little kids. In 1941, when Mary Ann was 19, she moved to Berlin to further her education and was placed on a stipend by her father. She overspent. She would need to ensure she had a good reason as to why, which is ironic considering the family spent many holidays away at extravagant places like Norderney in Germany and Nordjavik resort in Norway. So because of these rifes with money, Mary Ann tended to be much closer with her extended family, her uncles, her aunts, her cousins. She was all very close with those individuals. So much so, early on in her life, she actually fell in love with one of her close cousins. However, the family stopped between that. So that kind of puts her relationship with her extended family. She was much closer, much more loved, much more loving towards them. It is clear, however, that these good times that they had would not last forever. As we know, in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis began their true ascension to power. And with that, on April 1st, the SA and Gestapo began boycotting Jewish businesses, placing guards in front of their business to deter people away from entering and shopping. They would go a tad further and any left-leaning Jew with notoriety and wealth is shamed publicly and in the news. At the same time, Jewish schools and school teachers and Jewish students were being expelled at an alarming rate. The tensions arising between the Nazis and the German Jews caused the Strauss brothers to ditch an expansion plan in 1933 due to uncertainty. However, in this one scenario, they were wrong. In 1934, the brothers grossed nearly 50% more in revenue than they had the previous year, pushing their salaries to nearly 10 times that of the highest paid armament factory workers. And surprising the approach into the 1940s, the business was operating as if nothing was going on. While Jewish families were beginning to disappear, the Strausses were still in business and were very much thriving. So many historians have argued why that is, and most have kind of landed upon the theory that Siegfried was more or less paying off the Nazis and the Gestapo from putting he and his family in their sights. As we're going to find out here soon, they become very good at avoiding deportation to the ghettos. If you had money, you could avoid the attention. Then the Nazis realized the game these wealthy families were playing. They would buy off their hunters, if you will, for deportation long enough to immigrate and get the hell out of Europe. In 1931, the Nazis actually enacted the Nazi Flight Plan, which taxed assets of those attempting to immigrate out of Germany. In 1934, this entire plan was shifted towards only wealthy Jews. Originally a 25% tax, once it switched to the Jewish focus, it would be up by nearly 50% by 1937. For the Strauss family, the opportunity to immigrate was closing in, and their wealth would be destroyed if they left. For the time being, they would stay. They would double down on this thought by purchasing a large amount of land to build homes for renting. But by this time, the Strauss family was seriously isolated. Because of the mass deportation, the Jewish community around them disintegrated. Mary Ann even begins facing harsh and verbal abuse at school and quickly turns to physical abuse. But by 1938, it would prove to be the pebble that starts the major rock slide. Due to the increasing hostilities between the Jews and Nazi Germany, Dr. Joseph Goebbels gathers members of the SS and the Gestapo to destroy the businesses, not just block them. And on November 7th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, begins. This was a true official assault on the German Jews in broad daylight. Dozens were murdered, and hundreds of businesses, homes, and synagogues would be obliterated and burned to the ground. This moment would change the Strausses' life and the direction that they were heading on. The family realized that they were going to be targeted sooner rather than later, and on November 12th, Siegfried and his brothers are prosecuted as enemies against the state and are all sent to Dachau. Oddly enough, the brothers are freed less than a month later, and on December 9th, they come home. Even in Mary Ann's recollection, she never remembered her father speaking of his times at Dachau. Because of Kristallnacht, many cities were in shambles, so the Nazis decided to make up to their people for it and force a nearly $1 billion Reichsmark bill upon the Jewish population. Siegfried alone himself would be forced to pay nearly $100,000 up front for the damages, or 100,000 Reichsmarks. From this point moving forward, the family was desperate to get out of Germany. The Nazis had taken control of their business, and their money was watched. Siegfried began to pull every string he could in order to get his family out of Germany. So before I want to go any further, I'm going to mention a side note here. Before mass deportations began, many Jewish children or Jewish families were able to sneak their children out of Germany via a sponsored field trip to England. Mary Ann and her brother were both approved to attend and go on this trip, yet their father Siegfried denied them from going because he did not want them to get split up away from their family. So they had the opportunity to get the kids out. They didn't take it. So in October of 1941, while awaiting news for immigration, the family received notice that they would be sent to Lodz ghetto. However, just 2 days before their deportation, the Gestapo received correspondence that Siegfried had openly volunteered to go to the U.S. for the Bremen office of the Abwehr. And for those of you who do not know what the Abwehr is, that's just the Nazis' military intelligence division. So, in a way, like, spies. This ultimately stopped their deportation for the moment, but only at the last minute when they arrived at the station, they were told to go home. But due to the situation and how Siegfried had explained how he volunteered, the Gestapo were incredibly suspicious if he was lying just to evade this deportation. They knew of his wealth and his abilities to pay others off, so they needed to make sure. With this, Siegfried and his family quickly began to look at the fastest options to immigrate, first being Cuba. However, when they attempted to transfer their assets, the Nazis re-advised a plan that would crush their wealth, and it'd only leave them with less than 2% of their original wealth overall. But they were approved for the deportation momentarily, and then multiple snags arose. The situation became so serious that it actually reached the desk of no other than Adolf Eichmann, who oversaw the logistics behind deportating Jews. Not giving up, Siegfried begins to carefully manicure documents so it would be favorable to the Germans, and they are given a full green light to immigrate to Switzerland in 1943. Once again, 2 days before the entire family is set to immigrate, they receive a knock at the door. Dozens of men standing outside in black uniforms, and it's the SS. Siegfried is informed that his family has 2 hours to prepare their belongings to be deported to the east. Everything they had done, all the money movement, the lies, the paying offs, it had all come to a head, and nothing could be done to save them. At one point during all of this, as the SS are rummaging through their belongings, Mary Ann spots an opening to make a run. And without hesitation, she takes off. Now, Mary Ann Strauss would escape, and she escaped deportation. She escaped prosecution during the war, and this was all done by hiding in Germany. This was thanks to the relationships that she had actually built in Berlin with members of the Bund who were of a Jewish community. They were very headstrong on saving as many Jews as they possibly could and hiding them. So shortly after the war, she would marry a British Army doctor and settle down in Liverpool, England as a teacher for the remainder of her life. Mary Ann was the only surviving member of her entire family. After deportation, the Strauss family was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where records show us today that almost the entire family was liquidated upon arrival. No money, no inheritance, no family. It was all gone. Mary Ann would never openly speak about her family and the things that had been taken from them until she met Mark Rosenberg before her death in 2006. The Strauss family were once on top and were looking like they could become easily one of the wealthiest families in Germany. Their entire dynasty would be destroyed in less than 10 years, and they would lose everything but one person. Hundreds, if not thousands, of wealthy German families suffered nearly identical fates, and some of them would be wiped out completely, thus ending some of the largest and oldest business empires in Europe. As always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure you give the show a rating and a review. Make sure you follow us on all social media at World on Fire Podcast. And please make sure you guys go check out the history list for all of my New Englanders. You guys have to go check out the Battle of the Airfield reenactment from October 7th to October 8th at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. There are going to be hundreds of reenactors, tanks, half-tracks, artillery, you name it, and it's there. If you're really feeling it, you can take a ride on a tank if that's ever been a dream of yours. So go for it. It's your chance. The link to ticket sales will be in the show notes. In addition to that, I am also going to be posting polls here soon in regards to some ideas they are spinning up over at History List and have asked our listeners for help. They are beginning to plan a Pacific Theater-centric part of their work and would love to hear what type of apparel ideas they should do to ensure hardcore history lovers like us are excited and happy to see what comes out. Seriously, take the opportunity to do the poll on Facebook or Spotify. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for coming back as always, and I will see you in 2 weeks.